traveled with a group of primarily other Presbyterians to visit Israel and Palestine. Our first stop was in the city called holy by Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike, Jerusalem, the city of peace. Our objective was to seek out the hope of peace in a war-torn and contentious land. Jerusalem was both exactly what I'd expected and a complete surprise. It was a unique mashup of modern and ancient, holy and secular. My experiences in Jerusalem were largely shaped by visits to holy sites. Some of these were ancient ruins. Some of them were surrounded by lush gardens. But all of them had one thing in common. They didn't feel as holy or peaceful as I'd expected. While beautiful and ornate and worth it to visit, for certain, they were absolutely not what I had expected. One of our first holy site visits was to the Western Wall. This wall is one of the last parts of the ancient Jewish temple. Devout and pious worshippers visit to pray, leaving written prayers wedged in the crevices of the wall. The wall felt holy, not because of what it was, but because of the way the air was thick with faith and prayers. It was, however, like many holy sites in the Middle East and in Israel especially, both crowded and segregated. Men and women must pray in separate areas, with the men closer to the older and therefore seen as more sacred parts of the wall. It felt as if the women in our group were being told that our prayers were somehow less sacred. The first Christian holy site we visited was the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. This church, containing chapels for many Christian denominations, is the alleged site of Jesus' crucifixion and burial. While there's no real way of knowing exactly where it all happened, like the Western Wall, there is something powerful about a place that is steeped in hundreds of years of prayer. But there is something very jarring about the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. It is so crowded. There were people packed into every crack and corner of that church. Everyone wanted to touch a piece of God, and it felt impossible to find the peace of God. Iconic depictions of Jerusalem contain a common feature, the Golden Dome on the Temple Mount. This particular place in Jerusalem is holy to Jews as the site of the original temple, and it is considered holy by Christians for the same reason. Muslims believe that the Temple Mount is the site of Muhammad's ascension into heaven, and the iconic dome sits on the rock on which Muhammad is said to have stood. The Temple Mount, like the Western Wall and the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, was a strange mix of air heavy with the prayers of all who had visited over the centuries, and the bustle of religious tourism, and the threats of war and violence that have plagued Jerusalem for thousands of years. Like the other holy sites, it's a reminder of the Shalom the city of Shalom has never truly seen. The occasional rooster crow in the distance served as a reminder of the part we all play in the systems of sin around us. Like Peter, we too often turn a blind eye before returning to our piety. All of these holy sites sit in this strange city where modern materialism clashes head-on with piety. where buses and cars zip past ancient monuments and markers as blithely as I drive past the gas station near my own home. It is disorienting, to say the least. As our bus climbed the Mount of Olives, I thought that surely the Mount of Olives and the Garden of Gethsemane must be different. I needed the garden to be different. From the top of the Mount of Olives, distanced from the bustle, you can see all of Jerusalem and begin to imagine what it may have looked like when Jesus walked its streets. And from the mountain, we walked down to the Garden of Gethsemane. This garden is said to be the same garden where Jesus prayed just before his arrest. The stories that these aged olive trees must have to tell, if only they could speak. Here in the garden, bells called out to worshipers to enter the church. But here in the garden, like everywhere else in Jerusalem, the crowds were oppressive. While the crowds inside the garden church were respectfully quiet, it still seemed to be missing the peace of God that I had been seeking the entire trip and failing to find. As I walked back outside into the garden, I felt sad for the olive trees locked up behind iron bars to protect them from tourists. But then, there in the middle of the Garden of Gethsemane, I found what I'd been looking for. God drew my attention to a sign, a reminder that in the midst of it all, God is present in the small things, not in the crowds or the bells or the stained glass, not in any one city or another. A very small and charming lizard popped out comically and reminded me that God is in the things we miss or take for granted when we get caught up in the grandeur of human piety. The lizard and I regarded one another for a moment, and my soul felt rested for the first time since I'd arrived in Jerusalem. We returned to the Church of the Holy Sepulcher before leaving Jerusalem. This time, instead of going during the day, we awoke before dawn to enter as soon as the gates were opened. And another reminder of God's love for all of creation and God's attention to the small and the humble waited there at the door. A small orange cat was the first guest waiting to be let in that morning. This time the church was nearly empty. We were able to listen to the beautiful song of the morning prayers and to explore each chapel and room. I even found a mysterious set of stairs leading to a yellow door. The door was locked to my disappointment, but I was delighted by the opportunity to explore every nook and cranny of this public space in the church. I spent my time alternating between humoring my curiosity and simply sitting silently while the morning prayers washed over me.
Lights these candles. I wonder if it's people. I wonder if people bring their own candles or if it's brought.
As the light grew with the dawn, the whole church seemed to be greeting the new day and saying good morning to God. God hasn't left the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, or the Western Wall, or the Temple Mount, but the crowds make God difficult to see and hear and touch. At these times when it is hard to see and hear and touch God, we must seek God in the rising light of the early morning, in the tenacity and beauty of the flowers, in the silliness of lizards, in the stately calm of the olive trees, and in the eagerness of a little cat. Remembering always that God is not in the busy, that God is not in the ornate, but that God is in the small and the humble.